Hey guys, welcome back to the Juggernaut podcast, episode 2. I'm Gronderson,
I'm Dark Void.
and we're here with the second episode. There's a lot of good replies to the first one, so we've done another one. It's just about 2 weeks later, day after, so we're going to do this again, and today we're going to be talking about archetypes, deck archetypes. So, do you want to explain a little bit of what that means?
Okay, so um, decks are classified into archetypes in a lot of different card games based on how they plan on winning the game. There's aggro, which tends to play a lot of cheap creatures and try and attack their opponent early, get their life total low as fast as possible. There's mid-range, which generally plays creatures more middling costing, just really good creatures at every stage of the game, and then eventually get an advantage. There's control, which tends to just try and survive the early game, and then eventually finish their opponent with very powerful, high-costing spells or creatures. And combo works a little bit like control in that they tend to want to stall the game for a little bit, but then after that they have a particular synergy that's very powerful that they use to win the game. Then there's a couple decks that don't really fit into any of those archetypes that we'll be going over later.
Right. So we're just going to start off with aggro, which is the fastest deck, and kind of work our way back, and then, like you said, do those outlier decks that kind of don't fit into anything, just right at the end. So, like you were saying, aggro's a deck. It plays a lot of cheap drops, especially in Shadow Era. The highest cost you'll ever see in an aggro deck is normally 4, seldom 5, and if it's 5, it's just a powerful finisher. And if you play that 5 cost card, it's something that is just going to just straight out win you the game most of the time.
Yeah, usually. I can think of Mind Control and Supernova are probably
Right.
running some aggro decks, and that's probably about it.
And then it's not as much in aggro, but you also have, for if you're playing Yari allies, Pride of the Yari is a strong finisher.
Yeah.
Because just the more allies you have on board and you're swarming, it seems like a win more card, because if you're ahead, it might seem like it's helping you win more, but sometimes it just helps you get that last few damage through, because it just gives you exponential damage based on how many allies you have. So
So the most important part of the aggro deck is playing creatures early that
right.
can attack your opponent's life total directly. So it's very important for an aggro deck to have a lot of 2-drops in particular. Human decks also sometimes run Christopher Wilde, a 1-drop.
Right.
Because they just want to get creatures on the board as fast as possible.
Yeah, I would say the most prominent Shadow right now, just in the current metagame, has a lot of strong aggro allies, and that's not to say you don't see human aggro, but you see it a little bit more with Shadow, mainly because of Feasterling and Ironhide Karish are 2 very good 2-drops. Feasterling's a 1/3 that you can pay 2 life to give it +2 attack until end of turn, and it's 2 cost. And the other 2-drop, which is another 2 cost ally, is it Ironhide Karish. It's a 2/2, and any combat damage dealt to it that's 2 or less is just reduced to nothing. So they're both very hard to remove.
Mm-hmm. And part of the reason that Feasterling is so powerful is because 3 attack makes him strong enough to kill pretty much every other 2-drop that's commonly run. So Karash, will just die as soon as it hit by 3 damage. Puin, the most common human ally,
Right.
dies as soon as it takes 3 damage, that sort of thing. So Feasterling's also very good at keeping board, as well as being the highest attack 2 cost in terms of attacking people's faces.
And while
By face, I mean their hero.
And while it does have the cost of paying 2 life, you do have to keep in mind, if you're playing an aggro deck, your life total is of no consequence. In fact, in many card games, not as much in Shadow Era, but there are aggro decks that literally use their life total as a resource pool, along with mana or whatever sort of resource they have, because you can win the game with 1 life. That's one thing that a lot of people tend to forget, is that 1 life is enough to win a game, but you can't, normally win a game if you don't have other things. So paying the life, while it is marginal, if you're playing a control deck or a mid-range deck, a lot of times you're playing an aggro deck, you'll be activating his ability every time, especially if you're attacking the opponent's face.
Yeah. So a lot of people, particularly in Magic, I know this is a fairly common phrase to explain that paying life is not always a bad thing. People will say the only point of life that matters is the last one.
Right.
Meaning that, if you pay your own life total in order to get an advantage, that's fine. For an aggro deck, it's sort of like the only life total that matters is theirs. You don't really care how much you're paying as long as their life total's going down faster.
And with aggro decks, the thing is, when you talk about that, a lot of times, while you don't want to just let the opponent control the board, a lot of times, unless it's a bad matchup, it doesn't matter a ton what or how your opponent's doing. Your game plan does not change significantly based on what your opponent is doing.
Yeah, and another useful tool for aggro decks is that a lot of their cards are sort of interchangeable. In a late game deck, they only have so many finishers. If they just don't draw those finishers, they can be in a lot of trouble. Or say they only have a couple draw engines, like rogues have ill-gotten gains. If they don't
Right.
draw that in time, they could be in trouble. Aggro, you rely a lot less on any one particular card because all of your creatures do the same thing, which is just attack the opponent's hero.
Right, that's the thing in an aggro deck. You do have finishers to some degree because mage decks will play fireball, but you also, if you're digging for fireball, you don't care if you draw lightning strike instead or supernova or just some way to deal that last little bit of damage. So in aggro decks, you don't necessarily just have one card that finishes it, but you have a lot of cards that do very similar things, and in that way you have consistency because you just draw a card that does a similar thing but it's close enough as to where it's doing the same thing that the other card would. Another thing you do see aggro decks, they overlap with what's called tempo decks sometimes, and aggro decks take control of tempo, which just is short for temporary, which means they press a temporary advantage that they have, such as paying life, because in the long run, paying life might not be the best thing you can do, but by pressing that temporary advantage, they just leverage it and turn it into a victory rather than just eventually being behind on cards, such as Retreat is a very good example of this.
Yeah, and tempo is particularly useful in Shadow Era because a lot of decks are really good at just keeping board control. Like once
Right.
they've got even just a 2-drop or a 3-drop on board, it can become very difficult for their opponents to get anything on turn for more than like a little bit. So
Right. That's we did talk about board control a lot last week, and that's one thing that's different between Shadow Era and a lot of games is tempo is a very strong way to keep board control or to gain it. Come from behind, such as retreat into an ally, is a lot better than it would be in most games because once they play that same ally back out, you can attack into it and kill it. So tempo is a very interesting dynamic in Shadow Era, and you see it across all archetypes. So aggro just leverages it very hard compared to a lot of other archetypes you might see.
yep. All right, so
I
mid
would just say
range.
the main heroes. You want to go over the main heroes that
Okay,
play it? I guess by name, since we could, is
sure.
you see. I'd say Wagon Prax is a little bit of an aggro deck sometimes if it has a fast start. You see, Vest can combo out very fast with attachments. And then personally, I've played Elementalist aggro, which is okay. It's not a top tier deck, but it's fun.
In terms of humans, the most common human aggro decks are generally Aladwin and lowest, just mages, because they have Fireball and Lightning Strike, which are very good at putting the last couple points of damage on the opponent's
Right.
hero after your allies have done a lot of work.
It's very similar to a burn deck in like Magic the Gathering or other games because while it might play a few creatures that deal damage fast, its main source of damage once you lose board is to just finish them out with direct damage that they can't stop. Because that's the thing. If you have a couple creatures on the board that have lethal damage and your opponent kills them, you can't do anything. If you have two fireballs in hand that will deal lethal damage, your opponent there are very few ways in Shadow Era to stop an effect like that. So
Yeah, there's only so much life gain in Shadow Era. A lot of classes
right.
don't really have access to any good life gain. Only rogues and hunters really have anything that stops spell damage, and that's Spell Eater bans. And plus, that's like
Right.
a pretty high costing card, so sometimes aggro can even close out the game before it can be played.
Almost certainly. I've played Spell Eater bands, and it's just you lose games because you play it, you're on the back foot, you play it, and then they just ley line Nexus and destroy it, and then they just push for those last few points of damage a lot of times. So and that's aggro. So then our
Okay.
next archetype is mid range.
Yeah, so a lot of decks can sort of be classified as mid range. Mid range is pretty much just any deck that's trying to play good creatures throughout most of the game. They have less of an emphasis on playing a creature turn 1 and turn 2 compared to aggro, and they might run more later game creatures, like 5-drops or something. But for the most part, they're trying to, in Shadow Era at least, take control of the board around turn 4 or so, because that's when their hero power comes up,
Right.
and just, play good cards from there on out.
Yeah, very strong. This is where you do see a good bit of human mid-range decks. Boris is a very prominent example because his hero power can just kill an ally a lot of the times that would have developed in the earlier part of the game, and you see them play Retreat, Crippling Blow, his ability, and Yari Marksman, and those are just very good ways to control the board and keep putting on pressure. So it's like you're saying, mid-range decks are really, sometimes it's just a lot of good cards shoved in one deck, but really sometimes the way it is it's a deck that's halfway between control and aggro, as to where it's winning the game at a brisk pace, but it's also controlling the state of the game as to where you're still trying to control the board more than aggro would try to.
Yeah. There is a little bit of mixing between the two in Shadow Era. In other
Right.
games, aggro decks are a little bit more notable because they'll run quite a few 1-drops. In Shadow Era, there's not really a whole lot of good 1-cost cards. The only 1-cost that really sees any play is Chris, and Shadow Heroes just can't run him. So some mid-range decks will run a couple 2-drops, and they can end up just playing out like an aggro deck by going 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, and so on, and just not giving up board as well.
Right, and it's like you're saying, you don't see as much on turn one. You see more turn one plays as artifacts and control decks, but the only real turn one creature or ally you see is Christopher Wild, and very rarely you will see maybe a Rotling or something a little fringe in other decks, but for the most part, you don't have as many 1-drops in Shadow Era, and that's why he's saying he's right. The lines between aggro and mid range are much more blurred in Shadow Era than most games, and you just see a little bit overlap because sometimes mid range decks, if they get a good start and snowball, they can go aggro, and sometimes. I mean, that's really what a mid-range deck is sometimes. It's a deck that can go aggro if it needs to, or it can just control the game if it needs to and win in the long game. So
Yeah,
it's
so
interesting
against a
dynamic.
control deck, it'll just try and play creatures early and, kill the opponent's life total, like an aggro deck would, and against an aggro deck, it just tries to, slowly kill their things and get back board just like a control deck would. So mid-range is sort of like hopping the line between the two archetypes. You don't do either job quite as well, but you can do both jobs.
Right, which means you're a little bit more adaptable. Mid-range, just you see the gluttony or a lot of the focus of their cards are in the 3 and 4 drops rather than having crucial 2 drops. While they will play them, you see a lot more 3 and 4 drops. You have powerful cards like Death Mage Thaddeus, like we said last week, is a strong mid-range card. You don't see as much anymore. Grimghast is a strong shadow card. It's a 3 mana for a 2/4 that just gives everything else on your opponent's side -1 attack. So it's good for controlling and mid range and just helps you get into that 4-drop slot where you start hitting very good allies to play.
Yep. And Grimghast is something that's not as good in an aggro deck because it only, it's a 3-drop that only attacks for 2 damage, but it's quite good in mid-range because you play it, and even if your opponent has like their 2-drop and their 3-drop on the board, both of them become weaker thanks to the Grimghast, making it likely that it will be able to live a turn and then help you get back board on turn 4.
Right, because what it really does is while your opponent's doing even better if they have more creatures, Grimghast gets better. It does more for you the more creatures your opponent has. While you don't want your opponent to have a lot of stuff on board, it certainly helps you just control the game back, especially if you have a way to just make sure it survives, which is very important because it's just a constant effect. It's not like Aldon the Brave where it kind of goes on and off. It's just a constant -1 attack to everything they have, and it just really helps you regain board and just take it back, especially if you're a little bit behind and you have to edge back in.
Yeah. The reasons that Grimghast isn't seeing as much play anymore, uh, part of the reason is probably that it does pretty poorly against decks that aren't running a whole lot of creatures or aren't caring about their creatures.
Right.
Because, then it's just a 3 mana 2/4, and there's a lot of cards that are just better than that. There's also the fact that it's unique, which means that you can't play more than one. So people never really ran more than 2 or maybe 3 of them in any case, because you're not allowed to play a second one if you have a first one on the board.
That's true. But, notably, that's while that might not be the most prominent card, that's a model of what you do see sometimes in control decks, just that type of effect where it's one of those cards where you're doing something negative for your opponent and you're doing something positive for yourself just because you're getting ally on board. It's just something that you see are a lot of mid-range cards do multiple things. You don't really see cards played in general that just do one thing, but especially in mid-range, they do multiple things, and they tend to be very flexible because, like we said, they can go aggro or control sometimes.
Yep. So you want to go over what sort of heroes are used?
Yeah, you see it. Like I was saying, Praxis is something that, while it can be aggro, normally it's a little bit more mid-range just because it gets to control the board, and then it just keeps going until it wins, is what I would say. And I had also mentioned Boris as a prominent one that just has a way to control the board, and then it just the warrior tribe of Yari just has good allies that will finish out the game for you well.
I think Zaladar is also another pretty common mid range hero.
Yeah.
His hero power is identical to Lightning Strike in terms of effect, which is quite powerful at regaining board. You can like kill their 2-drop, and then with a Deathmage Statues kill their 3-drop as well or something. So Zaladar is very good at being a mid range hero.
And the notable thing just being that when it comes to the mid range, while he is killing 2 things and using your shadow energy, you've gotten rid of 2 of their cards potentially, and you haven't played a single card sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So while you are using your resource of shadow energy, you just did a 2 for 0 on them. They're down 2 cards on board, and you haven't played any cards.
Yep.
And then I can't think of any other mid-range decks at the point right now. Obviously, the metagame changes a lot, especially in Shadow Era. But
yeah, part of it is just that it's hard to decide what sort of deck is.
Right.
Aggro or mid range. I guess Bataru, Woven Bataru is sort of mid range.
Yes, I would count that as mid range more than solo Baduru. So yeah, I would say that that's something else. Woven Baduru, like you said, it's a Baduru deck that takes advantage of the Shadow Power ability to play weapons, but it also plays the powerful Woven Tribe, which is just a good attrition engine. So between the two, it gets board quick and it just controls it very well.
Yeah,
it's a top tier deck.
There's a lot of heroes really that can just sort of play good cards for most of the game and then just win pretty often. And I guess you could consider most of those mid range. So
yes,
just something like Amber or even like Aladwin or Majaya or something can just play lots of good cards and make a decent mid range deck.
So Amber is also very strong because that's plays like, it's a little not as good now because they nerfed General. But you can play General of Eunoxia on turn 5 and search it for a Crippling Blow. And then if you played a Jeweler's Dream on turn 4, you can attack with that, kill something maybe, and then play the Crippling Blow. So it's not... A lot of times you also see in mid-range decks, you see very powerful cards, but you also see a lot of slight synergies between them that sometimes are just very powerful to overcome in conjunction.
Unfortunately, that's been nerfed quite a bit because now General of Eunoxia costs 6 unless you have another Templar on board, so you'll only be able to do that if you manage to keep an ally alive until turn 5, so...
Right, but I think that's a little bit more fair in all honesty.
Yeah.
It was very devastating before, now it's fair because it just keeps you from playing just General and just decks, rather than having to play Templar, so it's balanced well.
Mm-hmm. And I could say, Serena or Garth, some sort of rogue heroes, can make a mid-rangey deck.
Yes, that's true. It's like the hard thing about defining certain heroes as different archetypes is like we were saying, we mentioned Mage as a class that plays aggro for human, but there's also Mage control decks. So it's, while you have certain heroes that play certain archetypes, just when you see a certain hero at the beginning of the game a lot of times, it normally takes you a few turns to try to figure out what kind of deck they have often, just because of how diverse Shadow Era tends to be. So, you want to move on to control?
Yep. There are some heroes that only really do one thing well, but there are a lot of them that can. Sure.
I would agree with that.
So, control is... control, instead of trying to play 2-drops, and maybe even running like a few less 3-drops as well, what they try and do is generally just survive until they can play a very powerful spell at taking back board, like Supernova or Tidal Wave, and then proceed to, like, once the boards are evened and your opponent's early game advantage is gone, they just play much more powerful cards than the opponent, like I don't know, Nathanias and some human decks,
Right.
or the King's Pride if you're a priest, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'd say just prominent control classes in general. You see Baduru for Shadow Hunter, and then Priest tends to be a control archetype in general, discounting Threatin.
Yeah,
Zana and
Threaten's
Jericho
great.
are control decks every time you see them for the most part.
Hmm. And Lance is generally a late game sort of deck. It runs a lot more
Yes,
6 and 7 drops than other decks do.
I've been playing that. It is, in
Yeah.
fact, I would consider a control deck.
Lance is sort of walking the line between mid range because he does run 3 drops sometimes, but for
Right.
the most part, he doesn't really attempt to take backboard control until turn 5 or 6 or 7.
I'd say just playing it, the main reason that Lance will run 3 drops is just because mainly you fall too far behind if you don't have a 3 drop. So it doesn't play them as part of the game plan, but more so that if the metagame itself slowed down some and everybody else wasn't playing 3 drops, it'd be more plausible to just start at 4. But the fact that there are a good bit of aggro mid range decks, you do have to have those 3 drops, especially like we're saying. I play 4 Priests of the Light and Night Owl are both very good 3 drops that just help you kind of. They're a lot of times play tempo, which just helps you get to the late game, like
Yeah,
Nathanius
and
and
it's notable that
Oliver and
yeah. Mhm. And it's notable that the Priest of the Light and Night Owl, neither of them is particularly good at taking board, but they're very good at doing something,
right.
like at least something, even if you don't have board. Night Owl,
Mm-hmm.
if you have less creatures than your opponent, will
Or
have
equal.
stealth, so it's hard to get rid of, and then even if it is removed, it'll draw you a card. And then Priest of the Light will remove a shadow energy from them and gain you a life, even if it does die instantly.
Right, and the main thing being, even if let's say you play out Priest of the Light and they attack their ally into it and kill it, and then you play out a Tainted Oracle and they attack their ally into it and kill it, at that point you can play a Visca or you can play an Aeon or some sort of 6 or 7 drop by that time, and then use Lance's ability to haste it and ambush it, and then you just start retaking board because you have these. At that point, like you're saying, you have these top end control finishers, and you have these big fat allies that are very hard for them to kill, and you eventually just start pouring them onto the board so much that you're not controlling the game with spells as much as most decks would, but you're controlling it just with very, very good board control and strong cards like Oliver and Nathanius and Ankle Breaker.
Yeah, and I think that sort of control tends to be more human based than shadow, probably because there's not quite as many good, really high cost shadow cards.
Right.
There's Dakrath sees a little bit of play, but that's pretty much only in Gravebone, and that's because he can play it for 4 shadow
Say,
energy instead of 7 resources.
because because the humans are actually playing the 7 drops, but even when you see Dakrath played, rarely is the main game plan to actually cast him for 7 resources.
Yep. Normally they prefer to just discard him earlier with something like False Blood Cultist,
Yeah,
and then just use Gravebone to cheat him in
that's
before turn 7.
that's not a strong deck, but that's a very fun thing to do. I will say. It's just,
It's it's strong sometimes.
yeah,
It's weak to like crippling blow and whatnot, but it's pretty good against decks that are only able to do like 2 or 3 damage at a time.
right. Well, I just say strong in the sense that it's not a top tier deck. It's definitely a strong play. It's just not
Mm-hmm.
super consistent.
Yep.
Because I mean, crippling blow still stops it. Zai's him, tidal wave, but it is also very good against some decks. So
Yeah.
but yeah, we did say Baduru was control. He really just leverage. He plays traps early game, and then uses his hero ability to play out a 7 drop bow, like we see again. Uh, Using your shadow ability to cheat in, and when I say cheat, I mean you're not paying the actual cost of the card. You're using the ability to reduce it somehow, and to get a 7 drop into play early. In this case, a 7 drop weapon just to control the board is very powerful, and he even buffs the weapon. So once he gets that out on turn 4 or 5, whenever it might be, he uses that to lock down the board. I swear you can't even attack into him a lot of the times
Yeah, it's
to deal
terrible.
damage. Are you playing Baduru right now?
Not currently, but I did ladder quite a bit. I got to, I believe, like top 15 or so,
Okay.
playing mostly Baduru. So and Otto is ranked #1 currently with one of, if not the highest ratings ever, playing mostly
Yes.
Baduru. So, although it's worth noting that the Baduru we've been playing is Wolven based.
Yes, it's Wolven
So
based.
it's more of a mid-rangey deck.
Otto's is his Wolven or is his control?
Pretty sure his is woven.
Okay. But Celebidur, while it's not as popular right now, it is just in general a very solid deck, and it has historically just always been. It's as good as the weapons have been, which typically has been pretty good still, just over time.
It was really bad back in Call of the Crystals, the first set, though, when there was like
Right.
one good hunter weapon.
Well, but I mean, at this point, if you have one good weapon, you play four of it. But at this point, there's three, and he plays eight total. You normally play like 3-3-2 of
Something
it,
like
and then
that.
at that point, you just play whichever one fits the situation. So it's just very powerful.
Another notable control hero would be Victor Heartstriker.
Oh,
Vic decks are like sort of between mid range and control.
I would agree.
He never really tries to develop the board early, but his ability gives him a fantastic amount of value because he reduces an ally to 1 health and then returns the top hunter card, and that hunter card is like always Hunter's Gambit. So then he just kills that ally and draws 2 cards.
Or a Soul Seeker sometimes.
Yeah, that's
which
true.
Is
yeah,
nasty.
And then he can also he can use Soul Seeker to kill the 1 health ally, gain some life so that he can live longer. So he's just extremely good when the game goes out extremely late because he just gets that draw every time he activates his hero power. He can kill tough allies no matter what they're doing, that sort of thing. So he's very good at late game.
And that's what he's closer between mid range and control. But I would say he shifts to control a good bit more than most mid range decks would, just because his ability has so much value. Just in the fact that normally when he uses his ability, your ally dies that turn. Like very seldom will a Victor use that ability and your ally not die, which just means that over the game he just not only is killing stuff, but he's bringing cards back from his graveyard that will get him more cards, and you just get slowly attritioned out as to where your opponent just ends up slowly ahead of you. And it's not noticeable at first, but he's a very good control hero that you do see on the human side a lot. More so when you have a lot of ally decks on the ladder. Because his
for sure.
ability is not good if your opponent's not playing allies, but
no. And also his main draw engine tends to be Hunter's Gambit.
Right.
2 mana, reduce an opponent's ally by 1 health. When Hunter's Gambit is removed, draw 2 cards. So generally, when the ally dies, you draw 2 cards. And because Victor sets them to 1 health, and then returns the top Hunter card, so when he sets them to 1 health, he returns Gambit, you play Gambit, it kills the creature.
Right.
Instantly, you draw 2 cards. But if they're not playing creatures, not only can you not use his ability, you can't use Gambit to draw cards, so Victor just isn't able to hit enough cards in order to keep up with an opponent not playing allies.
And even if they don't have Gambit to draw cards, a lot of times they'll play Poison Arrow, which disables and poisons your ally. So they'll ability, Poison Arrow, and then your ally takes poison damage at the start of your turn and it dies. So it kind of has copies 5 through 8.
Super common just because, the problem with Poison Arrow is if it ends up as the top card of your graveyard, then when he uses his ability, you'll get that back instead of Hunter's Gambit, which you pretty much never want.
Yeah. But it's not uncommon to see copies if someone needs to kill allies very bad. It, like I said, it just depends on the metagame. You're constantly adjusting decks, but it changes a good bit depending on what the metagame's like.
I've also seen Victor decks that try and run a lot of traps, as well as Survivalist, which is a 4 mana, attaches to your hero, draws you a card whenever an item is destroyed.
Yes.
So what he does is he works with like Snare Trap, Death Trap, that sort of thing. Plays a bunch of traps, kills a bunch of allies. His hero power will, reduce another ally so that he can kill it, bring back another trap. Every time a trap dies, he draws a card thanks to Survivalist, that sort of thing. So that's a very heavy control deck.
Right, and like we're saying, we're talking about Victor as a control deck, but it's also mid-range, and like you're saying, you see these synergies where his ability is good and Hunter's Gambit is good, but when you use both in conjunction, it's very, very good, and it's just literally the best thing you can do with a Victor deck. So, the last hero I'd say is more controlling that you see a lot is Zaladar can be, like, it can be a control deck, it just depends on how you build it. But that is a hero you do see play control some too. I'd say it's similar to Victor, where it borderlines between heavy mid-range and control.
Zaladar is weird because he sort of toes the line between all 3, aggro, mid-range, and control at the same time.
Right, he's been all 3.
You'll see a lot of Zaladar decks running 2-drops, like Ironhide, Karash, and Feasterling, but then they run a bunch of 3-drops, they run a bunch of 4-drops, and then many of them will even run Shadow Vein, which is a 6 cost a weapon.
Right.
So it's just very rare to see like a 2-drop and a 6-drop in the same deck, but
Oh,
you
it's
do
so
with
rare.
Zaladar.
Right, because you just see Zaladar decks like historically. I mean, I say this. I've been playing competitively for about 4 or 5 months now, maybe 6 actually at this point since February. But when you look at it, what really starts to happen is he's unique in the way he has played combo decks, he's played aggro decks, he's played control decks in history. But historically, there's normally been at least one deck where he's just a good hero to have, and it's mainly just because his shadow energy ability is just a good ability to have, especially if your deck's not just built around your ability.
Yeah, and I was mentioning that that's sort of the reason that Victor goes control often is that if you get to use his hero power over and over and over again and just keep getting back gambits with it, you'll grind out a huge amount of advantage as the game goes on.
Right.
Zaladar is just another hero with a very inherently strong shadow ability, so if you can just keep using it, then you'll probably get an advantage over your opponent just because your hero power is very useful.
Right. And it's like I mentioned earlier, but his hero power is good because it can just kill 2 things or kill 1 thing in damage, or just get 2 things low enough for your allies to kill. So it's just good in the fact that it I'd say it requires less building around than a lot of other hero powers like Vess or Elementalists or Mages, or it's just generally good rather than specifically good like a lot of the other hero powers you see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Zaladar's sort of the whatever you want to do with him elemental.
Right.
Praxix, it's very obvious you want to be running cards that benefit from being discarded, cards that like Reactorary and whatnot, and maybe cards that benefit from having lots of cards in the graveyard like Gravemonger. Or you want to play a mill deck, you're obviously running Praxix because he's the only hero that can actually take cards out of your opponent's deck. Elementalis, it's pretty obvious that you want to be playing cheap creatures that benefit from being buffed, because Elementalis is pretty terrible at getting board control back, but pretty good at buffing allies you already have out. So Elementalis decks tend to be aggro, or maybe like between aggro and mid-range. Zaladar can do anything. You can have aggro Zaladar, you can have mid-range Zaladar, you can have control Zaladar, you can have all three at the same time. His hero power is just good at everything.
Right. So do you want to finish up by going to combo decks and then just kind of other?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Combo is somewhat rare right now, I would say, at
right
least
now.
in Shadow Era. To be honest, I'm having trouble thinking of things that you did like called dedicated combo. There is a Rika combo deck, but that sees pretty much zero play.
I would consider Gwen to some degree is a little bit of a combo deck just because it's looking for specific pieces or to some degree and trying to stall the game. And then I had Woven Elementalist is one because you just see because what makes a combo deck is its combo is just short for combination, which means it's just trying to win by a specific set of a few cards. And rather than having a good deck that's focused that has synergies in it inherently, it's a deck that's a lot of times built around those synergies and uses just those synergies to win. And often it plays cards that aren't normally played in most decks, but if you use them in a specific way, that they can be very good.
I think I would call Woven Elementalis more of an aggro deck. It's a pretty aggro-y deck. It tries to kill people fast. It tries to play minions early, buff them up, kill people. The problem is that a lot of the cards it runs are just like unique effects that you can't really find elsewhere.
Right.
Like Confluence of Fate, you can run 4 of those. You can't really run more. Lackmeyer, you can't really run more than 4 of those. There's nothing that does anything like it. So it plays out a little bit like a combo deck just because you can only run 4 copies of all your important cards and you kind of have to draw them all. But it's also like an aggro deck in that it just doesn't automatically win when it hits your combo, but it just plays creatures and beats your face with them.
And that's the thing. I think what happens is when you look at a lot of other card games, combo decks happen because you have very large collections of cards. So there's cards that are not meant to inherently be a specific combo that wins the game. But over time, there's just so many cards that someone will notice cards that work well together or that go infinite in some games, or just they're not designed that way because they wouldn't be designed to be that powerful together. But when you just have so many sets, like Magic just has thousands of cards, and eventually there becomes just cards here and there that incidentally become very, very good together just when it's just one card and another card.
I know that Wizards of the Coast, the people who make Magic, have in some cases like actually tried to help make combo decks because they're not
They
entirely
have.
opposed to the idea that combo decks exist. They have printed some cards, like knowing that they would have very powerful game-winning synergies with other cards,
Right.
but that's pretty rare. Most games honestly try and shut down combo decks as soon as they happen, because combo decks are generally something that's pretty unfair in
Right.
terms of how the game's meant to be played, and that they just sort of stall and then win in like 1 or 2 turns.
Deck we did mention last week was the feedback Bad Santa Zaladar that is non-existent anymore. I tried to like build it the other day just for fun, like with a practice
Yeah,
list. I think just to feel
not that
Mimic,
good.
but it's fun. You see it, but it's just kind of combo decks, especially if they're dedicated to be this delicately balanced machine. So if they're good, normally they eventually get nerfed or banned because they're not supposed to go off consistently and they're supposed to have that delicate balance. But I would say that combo decks tend to be very fun to play in the way that you're constantly having to adapt your decisions or make them differently based on what cards you're drawing and what combinations you have.
Yeah. Throughout Shadow Era history, there has been portal mages. Portal's a mage card. It's 4 cost. This turn and then your next 2 turns, creatures you play have haste. So
Right.
the idea is that you play Portal and then you play lots of things like Shadow Knight or whatever, and then you can attack the opponent's face very easily. And you're just playing like high cost cards that'll do like 5 damage the turn they're summoned over and over for 3 turns until someone dies. Those could sort of be considered a combo deck,
I would
but
consider that.
Portal's pretty rare nowadays. Not very many decks are running Portal. So
Right. And I think that you just see combo decks tend to be focused around one card or a couple of very similar cards or, like I said, a good synergy. And while they're rarer in Shadow Era, you will see them pop up from time to time. So, it's good to be able to recognize them when that instance does happen.
I guess you could probably call Sosilo a combo deck.
Yeah,
Worth noting,
yes.
Sosilo
There you
has
go.
been nerfed since our last podcast. It's no longer the dominant deck, but definitely old Sosilo I think is a combo deck, in that the idea is like you get Sosilo and then you play a whole bunch of cards that give you
Right.
incredibly powerful effects while Sosilo is out.
So CeeLo gives you benefit for discarding, so then the rest of the deck is built around, okay, discarding for advantage, effects that happen when you discard it, etc. So it's
Yeah,
built around a certain combination of cards. And like I said, so CeeLo at first to me, it did seem like a very fragile deck that didn't go off as much. Obviously, it became very powerful and to some degree oppressive. But there were times, like if you don't draw your Knight of Eunoxia and you don't draw your Socilo, you just don't win a lot
yeah,
of the time.
because that's the thing about Sosilo is the cards they play discard cards in order to gain value, and then thanks to Sosilo they draw cards. But if you don't have Sosilo out, then you're just discarding cards for value, and pretty soon you just run out of cards to discard.
Right, which is something you do see. I'd say Socilo probably is still going to be a deck you see every now and then. It's just not as inherently powerful, and it's going to have to focus more on the combo synergy rather than relying on Socilo as just an insanely powerful draw engine. But it is a combo deck, like you're saying, the fact that it's built around. Because normally you wouldn't want to discard cards, but it builds around this strange synergy that it has. But then if that synergy is not in play, it just kind of falls apart and like lays down and dies sometimes.
Yeah, and Sosilo's the sort of combo deck that I think is pretty common in Shadow Era, and some games are like trying to make it, where it really plays a lot like a mid-range deck. It's just that it happens to have this one card that makes everything like synergistic.
Right.
Obviously, they probably didn't intend for Sosilo to make all their cards that powerful, but the idea is that even without Sosilo, the deck plays like an okay-ish mid-range deck, and then
Right.
Sosilo gives you combos that make your deck very powerful.
I'd say combo's kind of closer to mid range than any other archetype, and the fact that it plays cards are normally okay and holds down the game, but it wins based on a specific synergy, not on a control finisher or not on just winning the game early.
Yeah. This is, of course, very different from in Magic or something, where combo decks just don't even care about board control at all. They just try and draw cards over and over and again until they've hit their game-winning
Right.
combo.
And it's like I was saying, partially that's because a lot of other games have such a bigger card pool, and partially just because it's a different dynamic. Every card game is just completely different, even though you have similar elements. Their Shadow Era especially is dynamically different from a lot of games. So while you see the same archetypes in aggro and control and mid range, you see them played out in different ways, like we've been discussing this whole podcast.
Mm-hmm. All right, so last type.
If we just kind of said other, these are decks that don't necessarily have an archetype. The main one that we kind of thought about was Solo Gwen. I forgot about it. He mentioned it, but it's just a deck that
It's a
focuses
very
on
uncommon deck now.
yeah. It just focuses on winning by playing out weapons and buffing them, and then just attacking the face directly, and it keeps the hero hidden or unable to be attacked once it is in lethal range.
Yeah, so it works a little bit like a combo deck. The way it works is it plays rapid fire, which enables your hero to attack twice a turn. It'll play a weapon like Soul Seeker, just and then use Gwen's ability, which gives a weapon +2 attack and +2 durability. And that way, with Soul Seeker, she can attack a hero for 8 damage a turn. She can use Into the Forest and Rain Delay to prevent opposing allies from killing her while she's attacking the opponent's hero, and then eventually, so she kills them. So that works a little bit like a combo deck, in that you hit the right combination of cards and you win. But it's a little bit different from a combo deck in that it's certainly not trying to win all in one turn like a lot of combo decks and other games do.
Right.
It's more like just trying to stall until it can eventually achieve its win, and that requires synergy between cards.
One that's kind of also in this range is a deck that some of us have been playing around with. It's a historically okay deck. It's called Turbox. It plays Skirbox, and it just plays a combination of Wrath of the Force, which draws you a card when allies die, and then Call of Anmor, which puts allies on your resource pile that are 3 or less when they die. So it relies on that combination of cards, but it's weird because it plays okay allies and cards outside of that, but I would say it really doesn't have a defined archetype as much, and that's why I would also put it kind of in this other category with some of these
I think it's pretty close to being a pretty standard mid range deck.
Yeah.
The only weird thing is the Anmors, particularly, because what use does a mid range deck have of reaching like 10 or 15 resources, like Skirbox can sometimes reach?
Mm-hmm.
So for the most part it plays normally, but then sometimes it just reaches a huge amount of resources, draws like a ton of cards with Bad Santa or Sacrificial Lamb.
Right.
For the most part, it's a mid-range deck.
And I would just say, in the fact, we have noticed a lot of times is I'll consider something one archetype, and he'll, call it something else, or vice versa. And that's just because a lot of times in Shadow Era especially, you do see overlapping archetypes, especially depending on how people tend to tweak the decks the metagame adapts. So that's just something you do see, is that while you have kind of these different archetypes, that they're not super defined, and that there is overlap between them a lot of times.
Okay. So
that's most of what we have for this week. Was there anything else you had to add?
Yeah, no, I guess that's it.
Okay, so this podcast, obviously, you will have found it somehow. It will be on the forums. I will make a new post about it, separate from the first cast. We will have a Dropbox link. It's going to be on YouTube. Then also, we have a Twitter, at the Juggernaut SE. And then we have a Telegram channel, which will be linked on the Twitter and then on the post. Then if you have questions, comments, anything, feel free to message me at Gronderston, GRAWNDERSTON.
All right. Yeah. Or me at on Telegram at TJ Dark Void X.
So, yeah, it's I'm sure as long as it's still appreciated, we're still receiving support, we'll do this. It might, if one of us can't do it, we might call in subs or we'll have guests or something, but this seems to be well received, and it's something I enjoy doing at least, so y'all can look forward to more, hopefully.
All right.
So, see you guys next time. That's it.